my name's Graham Hobson, and my entrepreneurial journey started when I was in my mid-30s. I wanted to be more selective in what I printed and not fill up my albums, and I thought there must be a better way. If I buy a digital camera, surely I can be more selective. I realised at the time I needed a co-founder to kind of mentally support me, but also fill in the many gaps I had. In many ways, we were both taking a big risk. Successful entrepreneurship is a process of natural selection.
Welcome, Graham. Thanks for joining us on this week's podcast. Would you mind kicking off by telling the audience listening a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name's Graham Hobson. I am I am 56 years old, and my entrepreneurial journey started when I was in my mid-30s. Before that, I was a technologist, and I'd worked for some investment banks and had a good living and good life and enjoyed the work, but I got a bit bored. And around 99, I had two young kids. At the time, I've got three boys now who are all adults, but at the time they were very young. And we were taking lots of photos of them every week, and I'd go down to Boots with a roll of film every couple of weeks and get back a big pack of photos and just reflect that, not many of the photos were very good. So I wanted to be more selective in what I printed and not fill up my albums. And I thought there must be a better way. If I buy a digital camera, surely I can be more selective. So I bought a little Sony camera, and it took great pictures, and I looked at them on my computer, but there was just no way to get prints. Nowhere on the high street, nowhere online, and life's too short for inkjet printers. So I thought it can't be that difficult. There must be a way to have one of those machines that you see in the back of every chemist that print photos hooked up to a website with some kind of, order management thing in the middle. So on the tube, this is late 99, I was just writing a kind of business plan every day of what would a service like that look like. And eventually got to the point where I convinced some people to back me, and I started a company called Photobox. And I went through that journey for many years, which we can talk about later if you want to. I made many mistakes and learnt a lot. And I've somehow kind of emerged out of this as a survivor who knows a bit about startups and scaling and, how to make companies work. And I've, worked for other companies since, but these days I just do quite a lot of advisory and helping others.
Your story is actually a bit of a startup legend for my listeners that don't know. It really is kind of incredible what you did do. You started Photobox in 2000, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm just looking and trying to piece together the history. You were prior to that working at Merrill Lynch, right? Before.
Yes.
And so just talk, my listeners always, I guess, we love to understand how a lot of people want to know how to go from like working for someone else to starting your own business. And so just listening to your story there, you started making notes, you could see there was a pain point, there was a problem. But at what point did that kind of like those notes turn into giving in your notice at Merrill Lynch and going for it? How did that manifest itself?
Yeah, so I suppose I probably worked on this, I called it a business plan, I suppose it was, for 2-3 weeks, and it ended up being, 20 pages long. And I was just trying to think, if I had this kind of audacious goal of creating something new, how would I break that down into different parts? Like where would I get the money from? How would I build the tech? How would I market it? And I didn't have great answers for some of these things, but I did kind of have some answers, draft answers. And after I had this document, I started just talking to colleagues and saying, hey, I'm thinking about doing this thing. Now, I was enormously helped by the fact that this was 1999, and anyone on TikTok is way too young to understand that this was like the boom time of the internet. Suddenly everybody was setting up a website and a business online, and all you had to do was say, I'm thinking of doing this website, and people would say, yeah, where do I send the check? Right. So that was the end of 99. And
that does sound a bit like 2021, by the way, a little bit, but anyway, just have to say an app now, I guess. But
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there was a kind of gold rush kind of fever to it. And, you know, I worked with people in the city. I'd worked with people at UBS for years, and I was working at Merrill Lynch. So there were a few people around. I didn't need a lot of people, but I got about 20 people that decided they would be happy to invest a bit of money. But I have to say, you know, like I was good at my job, but I absolutely did not have the skills necessary to start my own business. I'd never managed other people. I wasn't super confident about anything apart from, you know, turning up at work and doing a bit of technology. So I was absolutely convinced that I couldn't do this alone. And I realized at the time I needed a co-founder to kind of mentally support me, but also fill in the many gaps I had. So I had a friend who I'd worked with for years, and he was a more sensible person than me and a bit more corporate. And so I lobbied him to come and join me. And I think he said no about 3 times. And eventually he said yes, but mainly because he got fired. So that was a handy stroke of luck for me. His name's Mark Chapman, and he was my line manager at UBS on the tech side. And he'd also been my kind of distant high boss at Merrill Lynch. And he was due to go out to Southeast Asia to run tech for them, and that all fell through. So yeah, he came in as a reluctant co-founder, but I absolutely wouldn't have had the guts to do this without having that kind of support.
That's a fascinating insight. Kind of, then you feed off each other, right? So you convinced him. Do you think it really was that he got fired that convinced him, or do you think he was going to jump anyway? Was it literally, okay, why not? I've been fired, fate, or do you think you would have got him in anyway? I
think if his plan A had worked, he would have gone out to Hong Kong and had a great life out there. But it didn't. Mark and I were very different, and I actually think that's a key thing to marriages, business partnerships, everything. You've got to bring different skills to the table. You've got to have a different way of looking at problems, otherwise you get this kind of bubble and echo bubble going on. But we were very different. But in many ways, that startup life I loved that phase of diving into product and tech and business development and like an endless list of risks and issues. And he hated that, I think, and he was much more confident with things like process, legals, bookkeeping, all this stuff. That sounds like it was very low level. He basically ran operations. But he told me about 3 months in, I'm not sure this is for me. And I think he said it many times over the journey. He eventually stayed with the company for 12 years. So he obviously did. It did work out for him. But I really worried at the beginning. What if this guy that I'm depending on to make this happen suddenly walks off into the sunset? What am I going to pack up and stop myself? It was a big issue for me.
It's an interesting one because he of course had a lot of options as well, right? So I think for a skill set like that, there's always lots of options.
Yeah, and in many ways we were both taking a big risk. It was the mid-30s for me was a kind of ideal jumping off point into entrepreneurship. I'd accumulated some savings, experience, contacts, and also a perspective of, well, maybe if I'm going to do anything else, this is the time to do it. I don't want to be commuting on the train and doing the same job when I'm 50 kind of thing. And so it was a good jumping off point. And I think we were both taking a lot of risk. But on the other hand, if it all failed, we would have gone back to our kind of technology banking careers and managed to recoup some savings in a few months.
Do you remember that time of handing in your notice at Merrill Lynch? Did it feel nervous, or was it obvious, and how did that play?
It just felt like the right thing to do. I think it was more of an issue for my wife, who was incredibly supportive. But I remember the day I told her in October '99 on a Saturday morning that hey, I've had this idea. We went out for breakfast and we were in town, and I said that to her, and she said, "Oh, what is it?" And I told her, and she said, yeah, well, that sounds really exciting. You're not going to give up your day job, though, are you? And I said, no, I am going to give up my day job. And she was very worried about it because, you know, it was a big kind of step into the unknown. And I think I was very conscious of the fact that she was taking as much of a risk as me for many years. And I didn't have a lot to show for it for, you know, the first 6 years anyway. It felt like all yet to be proven.
But again, I think like you're saying about co-founders in a business, I think your partnership needs to be, you need an opposite. Like my wife is a bit like that. Every time I tell her a crazy idea, she doesn't, she's got good at it now. We've been together 20 years. She doesn't instantly say that's crazy, but over time she does push me on it. And I think you need it, right? You need that balance. Otherwise, if you have too much of the, I'm just going to do it, you need a bit of balance, I guess. That's why it's good to have a partner like that.
Yeah, no, I can't remember what it was, but even last week, Roisin said to me, like, what are you doing about this? And I told her, and she goes, oh, that doesn't seem like a good idea. And I argued my point. And then about an hour later, I thought, nah, she's right.
This is it. I always tell people, marry someone smarter than you. It really helps. Yeah. It really helps. I made a mistake of doing an IQ test with my wife early on. She's way off the charts, and I realized, but it's really useful because it's, you know, but she's not a risk taker, which is not, it's not an IQ thing. That I think, you know, it's something else. And so, but the risk taking thing, you need someone to think it through. But just going back to the early days, so you find your co-founder, you managed to convince him, luckily, because he also it was the right timing, so fate played a part. What were the next few steps? Can you remember what happened next?
Yeah, I mean, there are many. Well, let me start by saying that successful entrepreneurship is a process of natural selection. There's nothing you can do at the beginning that guarantees a successful outcome, but the people who are the survivors and get to the kind of finish line, like I did. It's easy to kind of look back over the years and post-rationalize, oh yeah, I was really smart, I made all the right decisions. But the fact is I made so many wrong decisions and horrible, stressful, bad, dead ends. But on balance, I made more right ones than wrong ones. But they're only kind of judged by the context they were in, you know, like somebody else could have had exactly the same playbook and not got to the same result. So there's a large amount of luck and serendipity that gets you to a good place. And I really think that serendipity is a kind of key element to entrepreneurship, and it's to be encouraged above all else. And I only kind of learned that quite late on. But I think what entrepreneurs do is to make connections between things. In fact, that's literally what the word means, right? You pick up things between two places. That's what it means. And so you might like learn a piece of information and you store that away, and a couple of years later you think, oh, that's exactly the solution I need, or the person I need to talk to make that thing happen. And it was a bit like that with the early days of Photobox. I was really lucky in that some of the people I needed to make a success of it, or the early stages, were people that just kind of randomly came to me. I knew nothing about marketing. And when I was writing my business plan, I naively thought, well, let me just try and connect with, I don't know, something like PC World. And every time they sell a camera, they put one of our vouchers in the box. And I went to the dentist for a checkup, and he said, oh, you work in technology, don't you? My cousin runs PC World. So I thought, oh, okay, well, we have to connect with that person. So I contacted my dentist cousin, and it turns out he'd left PC World, but his name was Colin Glass, and he was he'd worked for Dixon's for years. He'd run Boots Photographic. He knew everybody in the photographic industry, and he ended up coming in as our chairman and driving a large amount of our initial kind of relationships and marketing strategy. And, you know, it's just pure chance that I met him and that he got involved, and he was such a lovely guy and really helped us. Similarly, my CFO was my wife's cousin's boyfriend at the time. And I thought he was a pub accountant, but it turns out he was a kind of minor VC and had worked with some NASDAQ listed companies. And there was a whole bunch of connections like that. And I think, you got to get out there and talk to people about what interests you and encourage those kind of connections to be made. They really help.
I think this is such an important point. I mean, one way of relating it maybe to my audience, if you've got an idea, for example, if you're holding on too tight to that idea, it doesn't happen. If you share it with the world, you'll be surprised how many people might help you. And I think this, what I'm taking from what you're saying there, Graham, is, you had this idea of putting the card inside boxes, and then you started talking about it. And that meant that someone said, "Oh, I know someone that can help you with that," and these things happen because you're sharing it. Whereas I think sometimes people will hold that in. That's a good idea. I won't tell anybody about that, and maybe I'll just try and do it on my own and get to Curry's Direct. But just by sharing it, right? You ask the universe for something. You have a basic plan, and then somehow it happens, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm quite a private person, but I do overshare what's going on in my head, and most of the time that works out quite well.
I think that's a really important trait in an entrepreneur. Again, one that's not really highlighted as a strength, right? But I actually think it is. I think just and being willing to share, and even being willing to explain. Like every time I explain an idea to my wife, she actually rips me apart for most of the time, but she makes it better, and then she puts it back together, and then eventually it's good. But if I was embarrassed to tell her because it isn't a good idea yet, then I wouldn't have got that process going, right? So I think that's kind of, in my view, why oversharing is actually really good.
And I also think, I've heard that's how comics kind of work their craft. They work their material for ages with test audiences, refining every phrase, every word until it's ready for prime time. And they can't just go out cold and say a line and hope that it's going to land and be funny. You gotta keep talking and refining your own way of thinking about the world.
Totally, yeah. I'm going to name drop here because it's the only famous person I know. Ricky Gervais is my neighbour, and that's literally how he says he's got as famous and as successful as he has. He shares it with his partner Jane, and he basically shares it with large audiences and just keeps sharing. And sometimes they don't laugh when he tweaks it, and then they do laugh, and then I think that's a very good analogy you've highlighted there for business too. So again, just kind of going back to like the early days of building one of your businesses, Photobox. I think the process. So you had this. Okay, let's start it. You got your co-founder in. Did you then think about raising money? I mean, did you raise money early? Then what was the next steps in your mind? How did you build it? Again, people wanting to learn how to build a business. What do you think? What were things that you did?
So I can give you the answers because they're kind of relevant. I took advice from my wife's cousin's boyfriend, who was our CFO, and he said we should aim to raise between, I don't know, 240,000 and 480,000 pounds. And I was like, okay. So we kind of asked people, and within a week we'd raised 480k. I actually had the checks in my hand. I do remember going to my bank, NatWest, and opening a new bank account and paying in 480 grand. And then at that time I had nothing, right? There was no company name. There was just like 16 sheets of paper that was my business plan and a bank account with £500,000 in it. And I thought, this is kind of where crime stories in the Daily Mail get started. Anyway, that was a weird thing, but raised the money really quickly. I think the kind of key word of the first 2 years was naivety. My naivety was that would be an amazing amount of money that would get us through to success. In fact, we blew through half of that money, before we opened our website at all. There were so many things we had to pay cash for that we couldn't we had to pay cash for the printer. It was 140 grand. There was no AWS or any kind of infrastructure service. You had to go out and buy servers, and they were ridiculously expensive. As a younger audience will appreciate that we had to buy 64 gigs of photo storage, which was a 2-man lift. It was like this big rack unit, cost us 10 grand. And of course, my phone would piss on 64 gigs these days. But anyway, so we blew through money really quickly. And by the time we actually opened the service in May 2000, we had a fairly small amount of working capital left, and we did have to go and raise money again. And we had plans to do that. It didn't work out quite as planned, but we did end up doing a small round. But somehow somebody had told me that VCs were evil, and I thought, I really don't want to go to VCs. So we didn't go to VCs for 6 years, which was a big mistake, because when we did go to them, they were lovely and they really helped. And I realized I'd probably wasted about 3 years of small business life, not funding the business earlier.
I think this is actually a very important point, because sometimes people's perception of, let's say, VCs, as let's say money men, and somehow that's bad. Mm-hmm. I think that is a big mistake a lot of people make, right? I mean, it's of course there's going to be good and bad in every pocket of every ecosystem, but I think it's actually quite refreshing to hear that that was a good experience for you, and you kind of wish you'd done it earlier. So how did you go about? Was it? I mean, by this time, what year is it? 2002, 3? What year? I'm guessing.
So we launched in 2000. So we kind of moved into a shabby small office in Clerkenwell in London in early 2000s. We went through a rapid phase of building out the tech and the logistics, the ability to print and dispatch orders. We launched in May 2000, and then entered this really slow, steady growth that I wasn't expecting. I don't know what I was expecting. I think I was expecting, ginormous growth, but it just didn't happen. But it's not surprising, because, like I said, I knew nothing about marketing, and all of the things that you would use these days to attract an audience, like social media, AdWords, none of that stuff existed, right? We had basically two choices. We could put banner ads on things, but they didn't work then. They don't work now. They never worked. We could do leaflet drops. I suppose we could pay for adverts in digital camera magazines, but none of those things really particularly worked. So it was a very slow start. And I can remember it took until December 2001. So that was, kind of 20 months later before we got to our first £1,000 revenue day.
Wow, that's patience.
Yeah.
So were you worried during that time? Were you questioning whether this was going to work?
I just think we were resigned to it being a small business, which is not what we'd expected. We used to outsource a lot of work because we only had one printer, and we couldn't do kind of large posters and things like that. And I was always forever walking around Clerkenwell with a zip disk, with images on, to go to some other lab and get stuff printed. And I remember walking thinking, when will we ever get to 250 quid a day? That felt like unachievable. I just think we decided to dig in. I mean, we basically went into small business mode because there was this catastrophic collapse in the Nasdaq market in May 2000. The whole .com bubble burst, and it was suddenly impossible to get funded. And B2C businesses were considered to be to not work. And so we just said, right, well, let's cut our costs right down. Let's not really hire anybody else. So for a long time, Mark and I ran the business ourselves. We started to gradually get, 2 or 3 more people around the next year, but it was very slow going.
So then you just mentioned that then you kind of, let's go to VCs. What year was that I was trying to ascertain that?
So that was 2005. And like I said, we let it go too long. And, I was trying to be patient. My wife was being patient. But at this point, I was borderline broke. I'd used up all my savings. I'd remortgaged. I'd sold my car. We hadn't gone on any holidays for a couple of years. I can remember the one thing that my kids wanted to go to a cafe after the park on a Saturday, and I was thinking, it's going to be like 20 quid's worth of hot chocolate and coffees. No, we can't do that. So there were no hot chocolates, no posh coffees every day. And in 2005, I was just thinking, it's been too long. It's been 5 years that we've given up all that stuff. we have to change the plan. And so I remember saying to Mark, look, we've got to grow significantly and raise money, or we have to give up, or sell the business or something. So we made a plan to go and raise VC money, and actually we made a plan to go do an AIM listing and to acquire a small European business and expand into Europe. And that wasn't the plan that we ended up executing, but it was something similar, which was merging with a French company and taking US VC money.
Yeah, it's very interesting the way you. I'm going to say I feel like you hacked the system a bit. Like you because most people again just generally would think, oh, raise money, but you seem to think quite laterally. So you looked. How did you even identify that opportunity?
I think we at the time we'd got to be. We'd become UK market leader for online photographic printing. And there was nobody that could touch us in terms of market share, and we were doing some really innovative things. We'd already launched photo books and calendars and lots of other merchandise, and it was going really well, but we didn't feel rich. We didn't feel like we were geared up for future success. It just felt like there's something else that we need to do. And I was thinking, well, if we're already UK market leader and this isn't satisfying, the only thing we can do is aim to be European market leader. So it was just a kind of big, audacious goal. And in order to pull it off, we knew we need money. So it was, again, you don't get too religious about these things. We need to raise money. Our first plan was do an AIM listing because it felt like quite achievable and cost effective. But when that didn't work out, we did the VC path instead.
And Photoways was the company in France you merged with, right? So how did that conversation even happen? Did you just literally like ring them up and say, hi, we'd like to merge? Or how did you actually make that happen?
So we knew them because they were, when you're in a niche industry, everybody else that is in that niche, right? So we knew these two guys, and they'd started at the same time as us. And we'd met them a few times, but we were both so ridiculously cagey. It was like ice cream wars, they wouldn't let us see their factory, we wouldn't let them see ours, but we talked. It's always good to talk in these cases. And when we were going to acquire a small Swiss company, and they had some really horrible tax issues, which we only discovered at the last minute. And so that deal was off. And, my whole plans had kind of gone down the pan. So I phoned up the guys in France and I said, hey, we've got an AIM listing ready to go. Why don't we buy you? And they said, we've just taken some VC money from the US. Why don't we buy you? And so we got together, we talked, we hammered out a deal, and that's the way we went. So it was a weird thing because Photoways technically bought Photobox, but in the end, we kept the UK name, the UK management team, not the French management team. So it was like a reverse takeover, if you like. But we put the two together. I mean, it sounds like a big deal, but they were two relatively small companies, maybe at that point 25, 30 people each. But we were doing decent turnover. I mean, I can't actually remember the number now, but I'm going to say something that kind of makes sense to me. We were maybe turning over a couple of million quid at that time. They were probably doing the same, a little bit more. So we put the two together, and then we said, right, next stop Europe. So we just made a plan to expand out across Europe, which sounds simple. There were lots and lots of issues along the way, but we did it.
Expand across Europe, many different languages, many different cultures. Easy. But I really love this point, and again, I want my audience to pick up on this point, because a lot of people that have a business and a lot of the people that listen to this podcast have a business and they're struggling to scale it. And I think one of the things that gets overlooked is teaming up with your competitor, or what is perceived as your competitor. Okay, you're in different markets, but both of you probably thought at some point we could be in that market. So there's always that perception of competitiveness, but this kind of 1 + 1 = 11 model is very powerful. And think how much time was probably saved if they'd already done the VC funding raise. You bought a lot of time there as well if they'd already done that, right? I mean, that was kind of a
Yeah.
But I would
the key thing.
Go ahead, Graham, please. Sorry. No, there's a
Yeah,
slight delay.
and the key thing about putting two companies together is it's got to make sense, right? And you've got to bring different things to the table. So in our case, I think we were much stronger at technology and customer service, and they were much stronger at the industrialization of the production process and marketing, and we were terrible at the things that we weren't strong at. So when we put both companies together, we were suddenly good in all four of those areas, which was great because that's absolutely what we needed. It was also interesting that Mark and I had been like super conservative in the way we'd run the company. We weren't taking big risks. We weren't spending big sums of money. We never did these kind of bonkers sales that would suddenly generate huge amounts of volume that we couldn't cope with. Whereas the French guys, they really had taken big risks and had really pushed things to the limits, to the point where, I'm sure they had a few sleepless nights, but at the end of the day, they created more value, and that taught me a lesson that sometimes you've got to take the risk and jump in with both feet. But it also meant we had a few messes to clear up when we put the two companies together.
Again, that's the interesting thing. I find that two founders is pretty easy to manage. Four founders, different locations. I don't know how you manage that. Did you have a management structural conversation? Like, okay, so I'm going to take care of marketing, and you're going to take care of... Is that how you managed to make that work?
Well, I think in the early days we were kind of muddling through with all of us around the table, and it didn't really work. I don't think we kind of found natural roles, but the CEO of the French company decided that he was an early stage guy and he wanted to step off and do some... Actually, he ended up being a kind of professor of startup and entrepreneurship culture. And so he stepped off. His COO stayed on for a while, but eventually decided to go off and do something else. And the VCs were kind of looking to Mark and I saying, well, which one of you is going to be the CEO? And I was thinking, I already felt out of my depth. Running a pan-European company, I'm completely off the rails. So I was also thinking, well, I'm ready to be here, once a week in Paris with my team there, but I'm not going to be there every day and I'm not going to move. So we said, look, we think we need somebody more experienced to come in as CEO, and asked around, and with the VC's help, we found the perfect guy, and he came in at that point to be CEO. I think his name was Stan, and I think he felt initially he was coming in for a couple of years to tidy things up, and he ended up staying with us for 10 years. And it's a weird dynamic because he's somebody that I asked for and effectively ended up hiring to replace myself. And then he ended up being the toughest boss I've ever had in my life for 10 years.
Why did you do that to yourself?
Well, I'm glad I did. I mean, he took us from whatever turnover we were at the time, maybe 4 or 5 million, up to 300 million of turnover. And through a kind of relentless program of growth mindset and logical thinking about how to break through each of those barriers. And I learned so much from him about solving those scale up challenges. I think I felt like I got to a good place in terms of startup business creation and getting through the early stages, but it was a completely different strategy to scale a business at the next level up.
I think this is another hugely valuable lesson. Now, I know what you said earlier about hindsight and how you just I feel like you did a lot of this on instinct from what you're saying, and it's easy to look back and, as you say, pinpoint moments that, made a difference. But I think it is something that is learnings that are transferable to people. And what I'm hearing when you just talk about this is that it is quite interesting to do two things. One, bring in someone that to take over from you, I think way too many founders get stuck because they're good at 0 to 1, but they're not good after that. But they get stuck because they don't see it, they don't accept it. They don't want a boss, right? That's what they think. That's what entrepreneurship is. It's not having someone to report to. Well, we've all got customers to report to straight off the bat. So but and I think the ones that scale follow the kind of formula I think you've just explained, which is you bring someone in that knows better than you, the CEO role, and then maybe then someone that will also push you, and is different to you. And that and although that sounds hard, I mean, I see that with people that have quite difficult board of advisors, for example. Steve Jobs said his favorite board of advisors were ones that never turned up for meetings, But in a way, I think that's wrong. I think it's actually really good to have, I guess, some tough love, especially at certain stages in your life where, you want to build a business. Maybe not now. At this stage of your life, you want a tough boss, but at certain points, it really can bring you up, can't it? I mean, it sounds like that's what happened with you.
Yeah, I mean, I like running, but I've never been a kind of athlete, and I'm sure having a coach for athletics is about having somebody that every day is pushing you beyond your comfort zone, and it felt like that a lot with Stan, and I he's a good friend these days, and I tell him how much I appreciate him pushing me, but also being very patient and waiting for me to catch up at times. But yeah, it really helped.
Did you argue? Was there friction there?
I didn't argue with him. I felt pretty put upon and intimidated at times, and a sinking feeling if I'd see his name come up on my phone on a Sunday evening, if the site was performing badly or something like that. But I fought with other members of the leadership team as we grew, and which is unusual for me, but it was a very kind of spicy leadership team. We had a lot of different personalities, a lot of different nationalities represented, and actually we did one of those kind of almost Myers-Briggs type evaluations a few years ago. It was called Strength Scope, and it turns out that every single one of the kind of 12 segments of personality type were represented around our leadership table. And again, I think that was very healthy. It meant that when a problem came along, there were some people who were strong at dealing with it, some that weren't. We all had a different way of looking at things, some more emotional, some more logical, some more conflict-based. It created a healthy tension. But yeah, we did argue.
That's an interesting one, isn't it? That was by accident you ended up having that leadership team. But again, I think a lot of people do. I've made this mistake myself. You hire people that are similar to you, but that actually can be a problem because you don't necessarily challenge each other.
The book I read last year called Rebel Ideas by Matthew Syed, and it's all about having diversity in any group is a much healthier operating model. You cover more of the problem space. You don't get blindsided by things that are outside of your sphere of knowledge. And I lived through that, and it was really useful.
I'm just trying to imagine, this Sunday night phone call from Stan and you dreading it. But this is your company. So, wasn't there a moment where you're like, I shouldn't be feeling this way, No.
I kind of plunged myself back into the depths of ineptitude and uncertainty. So, after we hired Stan, I said, I'll do the technology. I'll be CTO. And again, it's naivety. I looked at what we had. We had like 2 websites that I'd brought to the table, one for UK, one for Spain. And we had 2 different platforms, and we had 4 from the French company. And they all did different things. And I said naively, just give me, 12 people and 9 months, and I'll build this one super website that does everything in all countries. And I, naively also said, we can rebrand and we can have Web 2.0 and drag and drop and all this stuff. And of course, that project, it was horrible. And I remember, being about 18 months into this 9 months delivery and thinking, I was on holiday in Sweden with my family, and I was thinking, I have no way out of this. I literally don't know what to do to fix this project. I am so out of my depth. And I remember, I basically checked into the hospital at one point with palpitations after a bad week, and it was a kind of burnout. I just couldn't figure it out, and that, I guess, that was the low point. But it just made me realize that it's really possible to get out of your depth quite quickly particularly if you, like me, I project a positive air of, I'll take control, I'll take care of that, don't worry, leave it with me. And of course, then when you can't deliver, you just think, what do I do next?
Well, it's amazing to share that vulnerability and that. But how did you get out of that low moment? What was the turning point? If that was the low moment and you were feeling that way, what did you finish the project, or how did you turn it around?
So I think I went to see Stan and I said, fire me. This is not going well. I don't know the way out. And I think he said something along the lines of, just keep working the problems, like break it down. What's wrong? What don't you know? And I really wanted him to fire me. I didn't want to have to fix the problem, but I did. And I think over a period of a few months, we got, a little bit closer. We kind of de-scoped what could be thrown overboard. We focused on the core that needed to be developed and delivered. And I do remember that we got the website out after 2 years, but it was desperately slow. And then we spent the next 6 months making it work faster. And I've got this graph imprinted on my brain of customer conversion, which crashed for like that period where we launched the website, and then after about 6 months it climbed back up again. I have to say that particular platform was, it powered us through the next few years amazingly, and once it got there, it was great. There are so many things about it I would have changed now in retrospect, but if ultimately it did work, I was just naive in the delivery. And I remember reflecting with a guy called Chris, who was my first web developer, and I'd worked with for 17 years at Photobox and since then. And we said, do you know what we should have done? We just should have taken the old crappy UK website and make it work multi-language. Could have done that in 6 months, job done, and then on to something else.
Yeah, well, there's another important learning there, isn't it? Sometimes it's the old MVP kind of stuff that's chucked around, but it sometimes the creating everything from scratch sounds cool, sounds like a fun project, but sometimes just sticking lipstick on a pig, is that what they say, is sometimes better, right? Just trying to glamorize it up without all that work. But tell us kind of, first of all, the story strikes me as kind of the opposite to the Steve Jobs story. Like Steve Jobs is like, you're not getting rid of me, and they get him out of Apple, and you're the opposite story. It's like, better fire me, like I can't do it. I don't know what the movie's going to look like when they do your movie, Graham, but it's going to be slightly less dramatic. It's going to be, I'm fighting back. Wait, to fire me, I'm useless. It's, I don't know if they're going to get Ashton Kutcher to play you. I don't know, but yeah, the role will be different. Let's say that. But so I mean, just to finish off the story and try. So you basically you get the website. I was reading that you kind of had your kind of first sniff at an exit when there was a trade sale opportunity in around 2010, right? So tell us kind of what happened around that, because I think exit's always an interesting. By that point, you're 10 years into it. Was that an appealing opportunity, or did you still have the feeling that, oh no, we're going to keep going? What happened?
Yeah, I remember getting together with the leadership team in the spring of that year, 2010, and we were, I was pretty tired at this point. Things had got to a good place, but I'd been 10 years working on this. We also had, VCs that had been in the game for 4 years at that point, which is, the point where they normally like to start thinking about jumping off. And we went through 4 strategic options for what we wanted to do. And I remember that, selling the company was definitely one of the top 2. Again, Stan, who's a very methodical guy, was like, well, okay, leave it with me. And he was always chatting to people in the industry and seeing what was going on out there. And yeah, we had an opportunity to sell. There was a much bigger company from another market that was interested, and it got really, really far down the line. They were, drafting our personal contracts and everything. And my dad was in his late 70s at the time and had always had a pretty healthy life, but he'd contracted cancer that year, and he was we didn't know quite how bad it was, but we knew it wasn't good. And I remember him talking to me, and I couldn't tell him a lot about the deal, but I said to him, "Oh, there's a really good opportunity," and I went off. I remember I got dragged off of a summer holiday to go and have a meeting in Paris about this, and it felt like we were at the last hurdle kind of thing. And we came away from that meeting and we thought, something's wrong here. Something has gone. Something's flipped, in the deal. And my view was, no, it's fine. But let's give it a few weeks and see what happens. But it did fall apart in that autumn. And when my dad died, which was at the end of that year, just before that, I was saying to him, look, I didn't sell the business, I didn't have this big exit, but don't worry about me. I'm in a good place with this business, and something good will happen, and don't worry about me. It's because parents worry about your kids, particularly if they're entrepreneurs. It's like parents probably think, I don't want my kids to go in the army or be an entrepreneur. So, no, it was a blow. But to be honest, many of the blows that I've had over the years have felt terrible at the time, but have all been temporary, and something better has come along later.
That's a good lesson. I felt exactly the same. I think, again, for listeners, the moments that are hard actually give you the strength to do big things. And so this exit doesn't happen. But what is the next big thing that does happen in the business?
Well, I think we reflected after that in why didn't it happen? What was it that allowed the other party to get distracted? What was it that made us less than 100% compelling? And actually, we came up with a list of quite credible things that might have been the reason. And being the kind of proactive people we were, we thought, okay, well, how do we fix those things? Some of them we could fix internally, some of them we could fix externally. And for various reasons, there were a number that could have been fixed by buying Moonpig. And Moonpig was a company that I'd known for years. I'd known Nick Jenkins for years. In fact, he used to print cards for us. We used to do stuff for them. And we'd even kind of danced around, putting the two companies together at a much earlier stage, which didn't happen. But in 2011, we agreed a deal and we acquired Moonpig. So that was, it was probably one of the biggest private acquisitions in the UK for a long time. And people, it's on public record that we bought that company for £120 million. And people always ask me if I regret that, and or felt we overpaid. And at the time, I would say no. It was absolutely the right thing to do, and it was transformative to us and our group. And of course, these days they don't ask that question anymore.
Just thinking about the journey. Think back to that that December 2001 with your kids. You can't buy the hot chocolates after football on the Saturday, and here you are buying a company for £120 million. And how? I mean, did you ever? You must reflect on that. But that's just, how did you get the money? How did that? It's just crazy, isn't it?
Well, it's you have to kind of stop thinking, "Hey, I'm great," because well, first of all, it's other people's money. It's always other people's money, and you owe them, right? Yeah, and they want it back. But we did that through a combination of raising more equity and debt. We were a healthy business that was consistently growing and with good margins. So we were cash generative. And one of the good things about cash generative businesses is that you can afford to take on debt, which is much better in the long term than selling equity. And you have relatively high confidence you can pay it back when you need to. So yeah, it was a complex structure, but we did it. We brought in some new VCs to help, who were great, and yeah, we did that deal.
Incredible. And again, news, you can never be sure what's true or not, but the reported exit on the business was 400 million when you sold it, right?
Yeah, it was less than that, but it was still a very healthy multiple of the valuation at the point when we were where we were in 2010.
Which is an incredible journey. I mean, I was reading, from other stuff that you've said in the past, that when you came up with the idea originally, you were hoping secretly that Kodak or Fuji would do it instead, and you wouldn't have to do it, And so I find that also fascinating, that it's sometimes when you've got an idea, you just want it to happen. Right, and in a way, it felt like
I just wanted to print photos. I didn't, right. It would have been a lot less hassle if Fuji had launched that week with that service. But here we are.
I still like that life's too short for an inkjet printer, which I think literally should be a T-shirt. But what about success today for you? What does success mean now for you? How do you frame it?
Well, success is. It's about freedom to make your own choices. It's about, not worrying about bills that come in, and it's the choice on, how I want to spend my time and how I want to, contribute in other ways. That's what success feels like now. I mean, it's probably a trite thing to say, but I don't care a lot about money. Our car is 13 years old and the bumper's hanging off. I'm not a yacht person. I'm not a aeroplane person. We just have a nice suburban life. But it's nice not to worry about stuff, and it's nice to, support causes and things that we feel passionately about. But one thing I do kind of worry about these days is wealth inequality. I've always been worried about it, and I'm part of a think tank that's trying to put pressure on the powers that be for thinking about more progressive taxation and wealth taxes. 3 years ago, the average tax on wealth in the UK was around 2%. Whatever you'd accumulated, you somehow ended up paying away about 2% a year. It's now dropped to less than 1%. The top 1% of society owns a quarter of all the wealth in the UK. It's not sustainable because effectively, I'm a wealthy person these days, but I don't need to continue to grow that wealth. The way I think about it is, imagine if you were a fisherman, or an angler, and you were fishing on a lake, and you had an amazing bumper day where you're just landing fish after fish after fish, and you can't eat all those fish. So what are you going to do? Take them home and let them rot? You can give some away to friends, but in all honesty, you're gonna think, I had an amazing day. You're going to take a picture of them, and you're going to put half of them back in the lake, and that's not how wealth works in the UK. A lot of people take their wealth out, it continues to grow, and they don't really have meaningful ways to give back to society. And I think there should be a better way of doing that.
I couldn't agree more. And even this podcast, the whole platform I'm personally building is built on that premise. That everybody should have a chance to have a life where they don't worry about money. Everyone should have a chance to get access to the resources and network. And unfortunately, it's not even. You're saying quite right. I think it's not sustainable. I think it's just as not sustainable as putting plastic in the oceans and all these other things out there, because it's creating poverty when there doesn't need to be. I think, and I think that's the sad reality of it. So I concur.
I benefited greatly from social mobility. I wasn't born poor or, kind of in poverty in any way. I was, part of a normal middle-class family in a suburb. But my parents weren't, super rich. We lived in a modest house, and they had my dad had a nice car and we went on foreign holidays, but it was kind of normal lower middle class kind of upbringing. And I managed to, I guess through having technology skills, just managed to get, increasingly well-paid jobs and experience, and then have an opportunity to kind of launch into an entrepreneurial career. And I think everybody should have that kind of social mobility opportunity and not feel like they have to inherit wealth from their parents to get anywhere in life.
Yeah, it's an interesting subject because I think there's also an element, again, thinking of my audience, where there might be, you need lots of money to start a business, for example. And sometimes, if you don't chase the money, if it's like the whole thing, if you want to raise money, ask someone for advice and they'll give you money. Ask for money and they'll give you advice, right? So it's that framing things in a way that, it is about money. It is. Everyone needs money to live. But equally, if you can actually find your purpose, a passion, things you like to do, then if you make money or don't make money, as long as you can cover your bills, it doesn't really matter. But that's very different to what I think is the system working against people. Right, and I think, I guess people listening to this is quite a heavy potential debate. It's one we should have. I love it. I love to talk about this in an open forum, because I think what I've seen when this conversation comes up is people will say, well, if you want employers to employ people, you've got to keep minimum wage low. And these arguments actually fall flat. Kind of reminds me of the end of the Second World War, when a political party popped up saying, we don't want women, in the workforce anymore. Go back home because we don't want them taking all the jobs of all the men. Right, there's literally a political party at the end of the Second World War that said that. It was absolutely ridiculous, right? But a lot of people believed it and voted for them, thinking that somehow women in the workforce would be bad news because they'd take all the jobs from men, right? Ridiculous thing, right? And I think in a way that's the same thing with equality. If you pay people properly, then actually standard of living lifts for everybody. But I do see the governments think, well, we better keep taxes low, otherwise people will go offshore or people will leave with their money. That doesn't actually happen, right?
It doesn't happen, and I think the problem is we're hardwired, particularly wealthy people are hardwired to think taxes are bad. Whatever it is that tax is called or being used for, it's a bad thing, and I should legally avoid it at all costs. I should find ways to minimize it. But if you said to somebody, look, you've got all this money on deposit or in savings or in investments or whatever, and who's the best person to benefit from, say you carved off 100 grand of that money, right? Do you need the growth from that 100 grand, or could that 100 grand go into health or infrastructure or education in the country? Which one is the greater need? And I don't think people are thinking about the positive societal impact of releasing some of this wealth. And, who wouldn't want their kids to grow up in a society that's fairer, with more opportunity, with higher growth, with less crime, with more equality? Who wouldn't want that for their families? So I don't think it's being framed correctly, and I think we've got a lot of work to do.
No, well, I think this is such an important subject, and I can see from your track record that you're not just speaking about these things, you're doing things. I'm a big fan of Beam, for example. I know you're a supporter of them too. I just interviewed Alex as well. I think the other side of it is kind of impact investing, supporting people that are trying to make a difference, and Beam's a good example for me of that. Businesses that are trying to support those that need it the most, and a lot of the time it is just setting up infrastructure to give people the chance to do the right thing. There's not even much infrastructure around to allow people to do the right thing. I can see it from my side. I know, on the helping entrepreneurs front, there are a lot of people that are doing accelerators, for example. So these are companies that are already doing quite well, and they'll take a bit of equity from them and give them a bit of money, but they probably would have done well without them. And you've got investment VC types that will help people that probably would have done well without them, but there really isn't anybody helping those folks that can't afford a coach, that can't afford an advisor, that haven't got a business yet. They're almost like left to we'll get a job or you can't do anything, and it's a shame. And I think things can change. I do see the rise of impact investing. I don't know if you're seeing this, but I do see a lot more impact investing coming into the market, and I see a lot more people that want to build businesses with purpose. And so I see hope there in the private sector. I'm still a bit dubious on the government side, because they're very cyclical, right? They're very election focused, right?
You can't solve big problems in society on a 4-year cycle. It just doesn't work.
Even worse, it's 2 years, right?
Infrastructure project is going to be 10 to 15 years totally. in its cycle. If you wanted to tackle really big restructuring, the ideal time frame is 40 to 50 years. You've got to give people enough notice to, for example, I don't personally understand why we let speculators invest in property in the hope that it'll go up in value, because everyone needs property, right? We all need to live somewhere. It's a basic need. You wouldn't let speculators drive up the price of bread in the supermarket, because everybody needs it, right? So I don't understand why we let people buy property for no other purpose than it to increase in value, and often it's left empty with no tenants. Yeah. So I would implement taxes that actually encourage people to put property to use, let people live in it and whatever. Or if they're not going to fill it with people, then they're incentivized to sell it. But you can't do that kind of thing, next year. You have to say to people, do you know what? In 20 years' time, this is what's going to happen. And between now and then, you've all got time to adjust. You've all got time to adjust your investments and your portfolios. But we want to live in a society that recognizes that housing should be for people, not for investors. But those things take time.
And touching what I have a video on TikTok that's got a couple of million views, and I'm basically talking about how I don't think property investment is a particularly positive business. I can see how people can make money out of it, but the societal impact far outweighs the personal profit I think that someone can make from the property business, because I agree with you completely. And I do see, I found it, I was reading the history of the Monopoly game, the board game Monopoly, and it turns out the history, I don't know if do you know the history?
I've heard this before. There were two sets of rules. And,
there was two games. It was originally designed by someone that didn't like capitalism and was trying to highlight to people the problem with allowing people to buy property, because there ends up being one winner, right? That's how it works. And so eventually everyone else is bust and one person owns it all, right? So and they were trying to show a different way, which was, in their particular model, government. I'm not saying that's also the answer these days, but the government owned the land and people would live on the land and rent the land and be able to live together in harmony forever. But that game was not popular, so it got dumped. And the capitalistic game we now all know and love as Monopoly became popular. But it does highlight the problem. And so it's something I also feel very passionately about. And I'm very happy to have someone of your experience and humbleness and track record thinking about these things. So I want to thank you. Thank you for that. Look, I mean, I know we only have you for an hour. I do have a lot more questions. I wanted to talk about education and I wanted to talk about innovating in today's world. But I maybe have you back on another day, Graham, and we can also...
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure.
I'd love to talk a little bit more about some of the important subjects you brought up. But I want to thank you for giving time. I'll just end, I guess, with one question I like to end the podcast with, which is, if you went back to your younger self and gave some advice, what would you say?
Do you know what? Things have all kind of worked out okay. So I'd be a bit worried that I'd give myself advice that would put me on a different path and it wouldn't work out. I mean, there are many things where, like I said, localized dramas that I really wish I would have avoided, specific business decisions, bad projects, hiring the wrong people. I wish I'd been steered off some of those things, but hey, you've got to take the bad with the good. Yeah.
Well, if you write a book about that, then we can distribute that and people will be able to learn. But I'd go back, Graham, and I'd buy you and your family hot chocolates that Saturday.
that would have been nice.
Yeah, that's what we could all do. If we see someone walking around looking a bit sad, and we know they're an entrepreneur trying to make a business work, buy them a hot chocolate. Sounds like a T-shirt as well. But Graham, thank you so much for sharing your story with us and being so open, and I really appreciate it. And we look forward to having you back on the podcast another time. Thank you.
No, I'd love to. Thanks so much, Simon.